Beth's got, we're going to turn our attention back to H165. We do have an hour, we have until 11 blocked off. Then this afternoon, we've got time that we'll probably come back to the bill. Yeah, and just to walk through how I think we're going to spend this hour and then this afternoon. We've got some changes that we talked about yesterday that Beth has plugged in, and she'll show us those. But also wanted to sort of step back and say let's just review what we've got in the bill overall and take a little more time, spend a little more time sort of in each page and each section to be clear on what's here. Give everyone an opportunity to say, make sure they understand what's changed from the original bill as introduced, as opposed to what's changed from statute in this current version. And that may or may not take the whole hour. If we still have a little more time this morning, Julia's with us, and the reason, well, there may be several reasons that she's here, but we've had an ongoing conversation about should we or shouldn't we include the what I'll just call shorthand the childcare piece. And to the extent that there are numbers that people might be interested in hearing that would help us understand the fiscal implications of that, Julia is the person, or at least one of the people who can help with that. So why don't we, let's just, Beth, if you want to pull that up and we can start going through the latest version and we'll see how far we get right now.
I need to be made some, it says the host has disabled screen sharing.
He's working on it, I think.
Okay.
Should be good to go.
There we go. Okay, can you all see draft 2.1 with yesterday's date on it?
Yes.
Great. So this is draft 2.1 of your strike all amendment to H165 as introduced. Very little changes between yesterday and today. They are highlighted and we will talk about them, but it sounds like you want me to go page by page and just do kind of like another walkthrough.
Let's do that. Yeah, and we'll just check and make sure that if there are questions as we go through, can speak up.
Sure. Do you want me to go over the findings or just get right to the substance of the Universal Meals Program?
Well, let me ask, is anybody, and nothing's changed in the findings, I'll take it all from the bill as introduced.
Correct.
Are we okay to move past that section 1?
I am.
Okay.
Great. Okay, so section 2, starting on page 3 of draft 2.1, are amendments. So they are amendments to the school food programs statute in Title 16. So the first amendment is going to be to section 1261A, which is the definition section for the school food program subchapter. You can see that right here. And so this bill, your amendment is keeping the definition of approved independent school that's being added. It means an independent school physically located in Vermont and approved by the State Board of Education under section 166 of this title. There are approved independent schools that are located outside of Vermont. That's why that physically located in Vermont is used. And then your amendment is proposing to add the Universal Meals Supplement definition. And the substance of this has not changed from yesterday, but I did a little wordsmithing with a little help from Rosie because there was some feedback that perhaps it was a little confusing. So yesterday, the language that you saw read, the universal meal supplement means the reimbursement amount paid by the state for the cost of a paid breakfast or lunch under the federal school breakfast and federal school lunch programs. And then there was, let's see, what did the language actually say? It said, which shall be, and then there was a colon. And then there was the language that appears at the top of page 4, but it was separated with an and, a conjunction there. And it sounds like there was some confusion over whether that meant that the breakfast supplement was added to the lunch supplement to equal the universal school meal supplement. And that was not the intent of the language. So to clarify that, I just made these complete sentences so they're separate, so they appear more separate. So for breakfast, the universal meal supplement is a sum equal to the federal reimbursement rate for a free school breakfast, less the federal reimbursement rate for a paid school breakfast using rates identified annually by the Agency of Education from payment levels established annually by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and it's the same for lunch. Does anyone have any questions on this definition?
I think that's pretty clear, the definition. I did wonder, and this is actually maybe a question for Julia, if she has it, what those two dollar amounts are. And I know they change every year, so whatever number we have this year will be different next year. But Julia, are you able to give us those numbers? If not now, later on, we could just flag it.
Yeah, sure. Do you want me to go up now or?
Sure,
would you like-
yeah, why don't you?
Okay.
If that, yeah.
Good morning. For the record, I'm Julia Victor with the Joint Fiscal Office. I believe you're talking about the numbers for the breakfast and lunch breakdown for the universal meal supplement.
Just like is for one meal, what is that dollar amount?
Oh, I would have to pull that up. I've got the aggregated cost in front of me, but so the aggregated costs, we're estimating the range is going to be 26 to 31 million for next year. And then the aggregated costs, so I picked a number within that range. I said 29 million. So of that 29 million, about 7 million would be to pay for the breakfast supplement, and about 22 million would be to pay for lunch. And that's considering all of those assumptions and caveats that I've gone through before. I can certainly pull the per meal reimbursement, but I would need to pull that data.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
All right, I think we can go on.
Great. So the next, we're on page 4. So the next section here is an amendment to section 1262A in Title 16, which is the award of grants section. And as I mentioned yesterday, this section in current law provides kind of the authority for AOE to reimburse school districts or school entities for various different pieces of the school food program. So for example, they can award grants to schools who are standing up a food program. This section covers the reimbursement that the state pays for the reduced price meals. And so we're adding a section here. It's referring to the universal meal supplement, but we're not including any of the nitty-gritty. We're not including any of the program requirements here. We're referring to the section 417, which is coming up further on in the education fund chapter of Title 16.
So, and we don't have further down in the language, we will see section 4017.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. You are adding that to current law, and that's the language that will allow the universal meal supplement to be treated like categorical aid going forward. So the next amendment is to section 1264. And here we are establishing the universal meals program. So on page 5, we're saying in addition to offering those meals under the school food programs to students who qualify for free and reduced price lunches, each school board operating a public school shall cause to operate within each school in the school district the same school breakfast and school lunch program made available to students who qualify for those meals under the Child Nutrition Act, which is breakfast, and the National School Lunch Act, each as amended, for each attending student every school day at no charge. So public schools have to do that. An approved independent school, I'm on line 8 now, an approved independent school operating a school lunch and school breakfast program made available to students who qualify for those meals shall offer the same to each attending student every school day at no charge in order to qualify for the Universal Meal Supplement. So they have to offer free meals to all students in order to qualify for the Universal Meal Supplement, but they don't have to offer free meals to everyone if they don't want to qualify for the Universal Meal Supplement. So we are not requiring approved independent schools to operate a school food program. It's just if they want to participate in the Universal Meal Supplement program. Is that clear?
So, yep.
So then the next piece on line 13 on page 5 is in operating school breakfast and school lunch, a school district in an approved independent school shall seek to achieve the highest level of student participation. So they shall seek to achieve the highest level of student participation. And then here are some ideas for how they can do that. They don't have to do these things. We use the word may here, which may include any or all of the following. Providing breakfast meals that can be picked up by students, making breakfast available to students in classrooms after the start of the school day, and for school districts, collaborating with the school's Wellness Community Advisory Council in planning school meals. And then at the very top of page 6, the last piece of this section is that a school district and an improved independent school shall count time spent by students consuming school meals during class as instructional time. Any questions on this section?
Questions? No.
Okay. The next amendment we're making is actually a repeal. And so in current law, there is an exemption for public schools to not participate in the school foods program. And this is proposing a repeal of that exemption. So there's no way to not run a school food program now for public schools. Any questions there?
Yeah, any questions about that? And that's consistent with what's happening in real life this year with the...
Yes, Act 151, the Universal Meals Bill from last session, suspended the statute for fiscal year 2023.
Okay, good. I think we're good.
You're very tiny on my screen, so I can't see even acknowledgement of following along, so I appreciate the prompt.
We should speak.
Universal Meal Supplement Awards. Okay, here's this new section that we're adding. We're still in Title 16 here. We're adding a new section to Title 16, 4017, and that's the Universal Meal Supplement. And here we're going to get into how the supplement is calculated and how it's allocated and the requirements to receive it, the eligibility requirements. And this section is being added to the very last chapter of Title 16, which is the school funding chapter, the education fund chapter. And an allowable use, remember, if money is taken out of the education fund and used for something that is not specifically enumerated as an allowable use of the education fund, there's an automatic repeal of the property tax. So we're very careful whenever we're making appropriations or creating programs that are using money out of the ed fund. We can use a notwithstanding clause saying notwithstanding that repeal of the property tax, and then we're going to make this appropriation. But the other way is an allowable use of the education fund is for other programs within this chapter of Title 16. So you are adding a program to this chapter and making it an allowable use of the education fund. And it will be, the intent here is that it will be treated as categorical aid. So it's not that there doesn't have to be an appropriation every year. There does. There needs to be an appropriation for everything in state government, right? But the appropriation doesn't have to come out of a policy committee every year as a policy decision. The goal here is that the Universal Meal Supplement will be treated as categorical aid, just like the transportation reimbursement, special education, flexible pathways, school merger grants, English language learner grants. And it's part of what AOE is requesting in its budget every year. And it's handled differently than like in a one-off appropriation by a policy committee. So there would have to be an appropriation every year. But hopefully the policy committees are not going to have to worry about that. It would be part of the school funding process. Is that explanation clear?
Yeah, I think it is. And I'll just say that this was really to get at the desire to, if this is going to be a permanent program, if we're making it something that's ongoing, that it be ongoing in all regards. And yes, as you say, everything does have to have an appropriation, but it would be treated the way other school funding is treated. So good. I think we're okay with that, or I think we understand that.
Okay. And so the substance of what you're adding here is we're referring back. Remember, we created the definition of universal meal supplement up above in the school food program subchapter. And so we're referring back to that because that definition was technically applicable only to that subchapter. So it's not automatically applicable here. So we're tying that in by saying universal meal supplement has the same meaning. And then here's where we get into the public school versus approved independent school and what do they have to do to qualify for the universal meal supplement? So I am on page 7, starting on line 16. So we're in the public school umbrella now. So from state funds appropriated to the agency from the education fund for the universal meal supplement, the agency shall provide a universal meal supplement for the cost of each meal actually provided to each student in the district during the previous quarter, when meals are offered to all students at no charge pursuant to, and then this subdivision is the program that we created up in the school food program subchapter. Moving on to page 8. Reimbursement from state funds is only going to be available to districts that maximize access to federal funds for the cost of school breakfast and lunch by participating in the community eligibility provision or provision 2 of those programs, or any other federal provision that in the opinion of the agency draws down the most federal funding for meals served in the program. So you're delegating to AOE that ability to decide what program draws down the most federal funds. At the start,
Got a question here, Representative Levitt.
I'm just wondering if it wouldn't be helpful to include just a parenthetical definition of community eligibility provision and provision 2 within this paragraph. I know they're kind of long, but maybe is there a way to, I know I looked at them last night. It's not the simplest thing in the world, but I think I'm just thinking about some of my constituents who are going to read this and they're going to ask me, what does that mean? I mean, I kind of know what it means, but it would be nice if it was in the bill somewhere.
I'm not sure that we can, well, I'll let that answer that question, but I'm not sure that we can necessarily write it in statute just to make it clear to anybody who might read it.
Could it be under the definitions?
Beth?
So technically you can do whatever you want.
Yeah. Okay.
So a couple ideas here. You're right. The definition of the community eligibility provision and provision 2 it's not a 1 sentence or 2 sentence definition. So I think it would be I think it would get messy to start adding those even in the definition section. One thing we can do is we can put the federal citation in there. So we could say the community eligibility provision under, and then we can refer to the federal citation, similar to how we do for second breakfast down here.
Okay.
And so it won't give the reader the black and white language, but it will refer them to a further place to look. I don't know those citations off the top of my head. I would have to find them. But that's one suggestion. That's really my only suggestion. You could add language in the definition section. A parenthetical we can't add here. It wouldn't, from a conventional standpoint for drafting, it would just be far too wordy to do any sort of parenthetical.
Okay.
But we could certainly cite to the federal provision or the federal piece of law. I think.
Does that, Representative Levitt, does that?
I would just like it somewhere so someone who's looking it up can actually figure out where do I go to get information about what these two things mean.
Fair enough. Yeah. Well, why don't we try that suggestion then?
I'm fine with having a citation if someone, then they can just go look it up.
Okay.
Okay. So we're on line 6. At the start of each school year, the Agency of Education may require the Food Authority requesting the Universal Meal Supplement begin a new cycle of the relevant federal provision and group sites in a manner the agency determines. I'm sorry, I read that wrong. Begin a new cycle of the relevant federal provision and group sites in a manner the agency determines will maximize the drawdown of federal funds. And this is language added to your amendment in response to testimony provided by AOE based on the new Medicaid program and the new eligibility determinations.
So is it, how committee members, how are we feeling about that? Sort of getting it more or less, got it completely, not quite sure?
I think it's good.
Okay, good. Yeah, I think that was a policy decision we made that I think is the right direction. Good.
Okay. So we're on line 11, second breakfast as allowed under, and then there's the federal citation, do not qualify for reimbursement under the section. Yesterday, I flagged for your attention that in the CFR, the Code of Federal Regulations, which are the federal rules for these programs, they don't use the term second breakfast, they use excess breakfast. And so I'm just flagging that as, if this is a term of art that the field uses, there's nothing wrong with it. Flagging that for your attention. And then line 13 gets into a big policy piece. So I'll just read it and then we can kind of go back in and tease it apart. So a nonprofit, pre-qualified private pre-kindergarten provider that is qualified pursuant to subsection 829C of this title, which is the pre-K statute and program, and is not also an approved or recognized independent school, is eligible for the Universal Meal Supplement under the subsection if it operates a food program under a public school food authority. So a couple of things here. One, the highlighted language or recognized is new since draft 1.1, and that is a response to Rosie's comments yesterday, that after thinking about this language, she realized that there are some recognized independent schools, which are different than approved independent schools and different than a daycare center that operate a private pre-K program that we allow, and they're pre-qualified. So we allow Act 166 funds to go to them.
Representative Levitt, sorry, Beth, to interrupt.
What are the ages of these kids in the private pre-kindergarten? Are those 3 and 4-year-olds or are those 0 to 3?
So Act 1, no, pre-K is 3 to 5 if you're not in kindergarten.
Thank you.
But That's pre-K. This language is meant to address the private daycare providers who have children from 6 weeks to 5 under their roof, who are operating a food program under a public school food authority, and who have publicly tuitioned pre-K students with them. So they're a pre-qualified private pre-kindergarten provider. This language means as long as it's a daycare, for lack of a better way to describe it, a childcare facility, and not an approved independent school and not a recognized independent school, if it's operating a food program, 1, it's under a public school food authority, 2, and it's a pre-qualified private pre-K provider, they qualify for the universal meal supplement, and this language means every child in that facility would qualify for the universal meal supplement, 0 to 5.
Representative Levitt.
Sorry, I don't mean to keep asking all the question. So I have 2 questions on this. One is, this is new from what's happening right now this year, correct?
No.
So we're feeding these kids now?
Yes, because there was no clarifying language on this last year.
Okay.
And because these programs were operating under a public school food authority, AOE and had to make a decision. And so they included them with the public school provisions. And there was nothing in the public school piece of Act 151 that said you're paying for some children and not others. So they included everyone in that facility.
So can I switch and ask you a question?
Yes, you
Just
can.
is,
Let's have Julia come back up to the table.
sorry. I just want to make sure that I know how much we're actually spending. So these kids in this section were included in your estimate of 26 to 31 million for the cost.
I'm sorry, just to, which
I'm on-
kids?
Here, these guys. Page 8, line 13. The nonprofit pre-qualified private pre-kindergarten provider. That's hard to say. So what I'm being told is that these kids are being fed now. And so in your estimate for next year of 26 to 31 million, you're including these kids being fed again.
So in our estimate, or again, for the record, I'm Julia Richter with the Joint Fiscal Office. In our estimate, we are already including pre-K students at public schools. So that's being included in our estimate. The students who are attending the childcare centers that Beth is talking about, we're still working to figure out how many students those are.
Okay.
So I don't have a number for you today. That's what I'm currently trying to
Okay.
sort through.
Okay. Because that number feels really, and I'm just, this is for the committee more to ponder. That number feels really important for me to have because are they, so you're not including, so I feel like we can't say yes to this until we know what the actual costs are. And it could be 10 childcare centers that actually qualify for this. You know, I have no grasp of that. And without that grasp,
Yeah.
I feel like I'm a little bit floundering. And if I can't explain what all of the costs are, or even like just a really good estimate, I don't expect it to be like, it's going to be, $300,550.18. Yeah. So that's just the piece that I just want to know roughly what you guys think it might cost.
Yeah, so we're definitely working on the estimate. We don't have it yet. In terms of, I would be happy to provide if it would be helpful for you to have a sense of, how much an additional 1,000 students might cost, or I could certainly provide that. But at this point, I don't know how many students there are, so I can't provide that number.
Right. Okay.
Well, so whatever you can provide, I think would be useful while we're stopped and thinking, while we're thinking about this. So, so what do you know, or what can you project?
So I do want to say that the huge caveat, because I think credibility is very important, that any numbers that I put out are not talking about actually the costs, but just so you have sort of a sense of the universe that we're talking in. So the kindergarten cohort, so how many kids are attending kindergarten right now, is around 5,000. So 5,000 to 6,000 students. So when we look at our model and we plug in all of the same assumptions that we're using to get to that range of 26 to 31, remember that depends on how many dollars are being pulled down from the federal government, how many kids are eating meals. So about 5,000 pupils, that corresponds with about $5 million. That's really rough, but just so that you have a sense of, now, I'm not testifying that this will be $2 million. We need to figure out how many students there are.
Is it 2 million or 5 million?
Oh, did I say 5 million?
You did.
5,000 pupils is 2 million.
Got it, okay.
Sorry.
It's better.
Good. I heard 5 million too, and I was like, ooh. So that makes much more sense anyway. If the total is 29 million, that kindergartners alone would be.
But then what about the 0 to 3 range? How many?
Right, so I don't know what that number is.
Okay, I'll
and I'm
stop
working
asking
to
that.
figure out what that number is.
Sorry.
So I don't have that number and I'm working to get
Okay,
there.
I will stop busting your chops. I apologize.
Representative Gold.
I would also say, having fed a lot of 3 to 4 year olds in an early childhood education center, the cost of feeding those students is quite lower than I imagine a high school student. But of course, we're going to use the same data to sort of apply to these groups, but that, you know, there's definitely wiggle room there too.
Well, they're tiny, so it
They are
helps.
very small.
And I think that's an excellent point, and that gets back to, we're talking about the universal meals supplement. So we're talking about the cost of the difference between the paid rate and the free rate. So that's what we're looking at when we're estimating the costs, not necessarily the actual cost of providing the meal, but what is that difference between the federal government reimbursement rates?
Right, okay.
So as written, that it's a dollar amount, and it was the question I asked earlier, what exactly is the dollar amount? It's a number, $4, $3, something that Julia's gonna help us understand later. And that is, it's the same amount for whether it's an 18-month-old or a 12th grader. That's the reimbursement.
Yeah, so for 2020, the 22-23 school year, for the paid rate, the lunch average family contribution is $3.70 for lunch. Breakfast is $1.76. So that's for a single meal. I do think or I guess I'll pause there until I have finished clicking the data.
So just,
That's the paid rate from the government, or that, just say that again, I'm sorry.
So from the federal government, we're looking at the difference between, so if you remember the way that it's structured, we have the free rate, the reduced rate, and the paid rate coming from the federal government.
Right.
Currently, the state of Vermont is covering out of an appropriation out of the general fund, the difference between the reduced rate and the free rate. So without universal meals, students are either not paying for the meal, receiving the free meal, or they're paying the paid rate because the state is making up the difference between free and reduced. So the paid rate for lunch is $3.70 in the current school year. And the paid rate for breakfast is $1.76. And that changes every year from the federal government.
so
Thank you very much.
that's the.
I'm good, thank you, no, that's great.
So that's the paid rate, but it's the difference that is it's the supplement amount that matters.
So that is capturing the difference.
The supplement is
$3.70 because there are, even for the paid meals, there are some dollars that are flowing down from the federal government. It's just much less than from the federal. So in the paid category in the current school year, the federal cash reimbursement is 77 cents.
Would you be able to separate the food cost out of that per meal number?
That would be a question for the agency or people with boots on the ground. I wouldn't be able to, but maybe they could.
Okay, thank you.
Right, and yeah, we were talking about, what is the actual food cost, and which isn't addressed at all in this, in this bill anywhere, okay. John, I know you're there, and I didn't want you to be left out if you had any questions, so jump in anytime.
Sure. Yeah, I'm just quietly floundering away on Zoom.
Okay.
Poor guy.
I'm trying to get my head around the math of the reduced lunches and Vermont's share of that appropriation. So if this bill passed, does that line item change at all? Because say, for example, we're opening the program up to say some pre-K, or does the reduced, I'm just wondering if that reduced number is affected by this bill at all, or is more or less the department, the Agency of Education, whatever they come up, I guess, with an appropriation for reduced meals, is that approximately going to stay the same?
That's a great question. That is a policy decision of how you want to address, if you want to address reduced meals. The way that I currently read the bill is that it is just making up that difference. And so the estimated costs that we have here are in addition to the current cost of supplementing the difference between free and reduced.
So, for example, if a approved independent school decided not to opt in for the universal school meal supplement, but they did want to offer free and reduced still, is Vermont still on the hook for making up that reduced difference?
I would defer to Beth because I think that's more of a legal question.
Thank you. So this bill does not amend in any way the law around the state's responsibility for reduced price meals. So currently the law requires the state to appropriate funds to AOE, and then AOE to award to each supervisory union, independent school board, and approved education program a sum equal to the amount that would have been the student share of breakfast or lunch during the previous quarter to students eligible for reduced price breakfast under the federal school breakfast and lunch program. So current law is that the state is picking up the tab for the student share of the reduced price meal, so that not covered by the federal government or federal funds, for public school kids, independent school kids, and students in approved education programs, which are those teen parent programs. That's current law, and Act 151 and this bill make no amendments to that responsibility. So how AOE is, if Act 151 is affecting those reimbursements, would be, I think, a question to ask AOE. You haven't amended that responsibility in any way, so there's not really any authority for the state not to pay that. I think that would be a question for AOE if they're seeing any difference there.
Okay. So I guess one way to think about it, besides maybe, right, if the program's expanding and we might pick up new students or kiddos, as you say, there might be some collected there if those pre-K, say, don't actually opt in for the universal school meals, but want to do meals for free and reduced kids. But I think I see where this is going, is that we're already paying for free meals, our share. We're already paying our share for the reduced meals. So this is paying for the paid meals. And that's our appropriation, right? The 29 whatever million.
I believe so. I, again, would defer Julia on her math there, but yes.
And maybe Julia, have you seen the numbers for, in the last 2 years, what it costs this, I guess, the state share for the reduced meals?
Yes, and I do believe I sent that in an email to the committee a couple weeks ago or a week ago, but I can certainly pull it up. I don't have it in front of me and forward that to Laura to forward to you.
Okay, great. Thank you.
My recollection, it was several $100,000, not a million, not as much as $1 million. And maybe here's a way to put it. There's no double payment here to that group or to any group.
That's correct. So I did just pull it up in front. I'm happy to forward it to Laura to have it shared around again. But so the question that I responded to was prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, because remember in the COVID-19 pandemic, more federal funds came to the state for universal meals. So in 2018, the state spent a total of $380,808 to pay the student share between reduced price meals and free meals. So that was an appropriation out of the general fund. And so that is not going to be double, as the chair mentioned, that's not being double counted in the estimate. We're really looking at, that remainder.
All set, John?
Yep, thank you.
Good, okay, thanks for the question and clarifying that. So while we're still paused on this section, just to summarize, we heard that the kindergarten cohort is 5,000 students-ish, around 5,000, and that the cost associated with them for a full year is around $2 million. We don't know exactly what the population is for 4-year-olds, 3-year-olds and below, but it gives us a ballpark anyway. And when you have more information, you'll be able to come back with what a possible range is for costs. And can you tell us what the more information will be that they're hoping to get from AOE?
Sure. So it's a combined process of trying to work to refine the estimate. And I do want to, so when I would come back, it would be an updated estimate to factor in our new information of this potential growth in universe of the students that are being included in our estimate. And I do want to reiterate that while we're talking about a cohort, a kindergarten cohort, that doesn't mean that every parent is putting every child into a pre-K program or a child care center program. So it's not necessarily, I'm not saying that the assumption would be that we're having the same cohort of kindergartners and 7th graders as we are for a 2-year-old in a private child care center.
Right.
So it's just something to keep in mind in terms of that universe of kids.
Okay. All right, any thoughts or questions, Brendan?
I just, I'm gonna run out of time again. Just a general question or statement, I guess. So we've been feeding school kids for decades, correct? If this bill is to not pass, we would still be feeding school kids. Is that correct?
Is that a question for me?
Whoever wants to answer.
All right, I will jump in, but Beth, feel free to jump in if you want. So before the COVID-19 pandemic and the increase in federal funds, there were school meals that were being offered in schools certain students, depending on their economic background, were eligible for free meals from the school cafeteria. Those students who were not eligible had to pay for the meals at the school cafeteria. So if this bill, the way I understand your question, if the bill were to not pass, cafeterias in schools would not cease to operate, but it's really a matter of how are meals being paid for or not being paid for? Who's picking up the tab?
Thank you.
Representative Copeland?
And just to add a nuance onto that, Rep. Graham, there was the issue of the missing middle. So there are children who belong to families that are not eligible for free meals, but cannot afford to feed their children nonetheless. So there was a segment of the population of school-age kids who are not, they may have been able to receive a meal, but they weren't paying for it. And I believe that money at the end of the year came out of the general education fund.
From each school district.
From each school district, right. So yes, they were all being paid, but this is a more transparent way of paying for it, rather than the ambiguity of who is paying their bill, who isn't. And it relieves the school staff of time having to hunt down that money from parents who aren't paying their bills.
Let's have a question for Representative Cole, then we'll pause this conversation, take a break. Representative Cole.
Yes, it's not a question, and it's, I don't think it's necessarily relevant to your work here, and I want to make the most of your time and being here, of course. It's more of a compilation of several different studies I've been looking over, and just how this program would change sort of the whole way of the system of working, and just how the cafeteria works and feeding our kids works versus prior implementation without this. So that's more of a longer list of different pieces that I think would be important in helping guide our decision here.
The only other thought I have is that if absent this bill, there would no longer be a requirement that public schools offer the programs. So, and we don't know whether the schools that weren't offering them would stop offering them, or whether anybody else would stop offering them. But part of one thing this bill does is every school does have to offer the free meals program, so that those who qualify federally would be eligible to get it. So that could go away.
Can I ask a clarifying question?
Yes. And then we'll break.
So pre-COVID, what you just said, that if a child qualified for free lunch, that money was coming from 100% from the federal government. They could also qualify for a reduced lunch. That money was coming partially from the federal government, and we were picking up the difference, correct?
Mm-hmm.
And now that would be the same situation. If a child qualified for free lunch, the money would come 100% from the federal government. If a child qualified for reduced, a portion would come from the federal government, a portion would come from this, and we would be paying for anyone else that wanted a free lunch.
That is correct. Okay. And I will just add the nuance, especially because this is the Agricultural Food Committee, that the price, everything that you just said is completely correct. And the price of a meal in the school, the cost, the associated food costs that I've heard the committee is interested in may not correspond directly with those prices of the federal government, but everything that we're talking about here is picking up exactly what you just said.
Okay. One more follow-up. Any child that did not qualify for, or does not qualify for a free lunch, now we would be paying the full amount, or would there be any drawdown from the federal government?
So as it is now, every student who eats a meal, breakfast or lunch, is pulling down some dollars from the federal government. It's just those students who are class qualified as paid, the portion that they're drawing down in federal funds is much, much less than the portion being pulled down from free and reduced.
Okay, see, got it. Thank you.
And there is the provision in the bill that requires for schools to participate in these programs to continue to draw down the federal funds.
John, I see you've got your hand up. Do you want to get it in now, or do you want to hold it till when we come back later?
I can try now just because we might have to send Julia looking for some numbers, but because we've had so much data on this, but I remember that, 38% approximately of our students are eligible for free or reduced lunch. Was that a number that maybe the agent gave us? So I was wondering, and this may have been provided, but I missed it. If we break it down to 100 students, so 38 are eligible for free and reduced. The other, 62% would be paying. What in the last 2 years, what has been the participation rate of those two groups? So, out of 100 kids, 38 are eligible for the free and reduced, but I wonder how many are actually, still bringing lunches from home, and the same with the 62%, because those numbers affect ultimately how much Vermont has to come up with for an appropriation. And whether those numbers, I would suspect, if this goes as planned and we have tastier meals from local farm food, how much they would grow too, I guess.
Yeah, so a lot to unpack there. The 38 eligible is the eligibility percentage from fall of 2019. And so there is, with the Medicaid pilot that's coming up this summer, there is anticipation from a lot of folks who are saying that eligibility is likely going to go up again to around that 38%. What we saw in October of 2022, this past October, the first month of the Universal School Meals Program, that in fact there are 34.85% who are eligible. So this doesn't mean that the number of students who come from economically disadvantaged backgrounds necessarily dropped in the state. It could also mean that fewer families were filling out the required forms to pull down those federal funds. So right now we're seeing the 34.85%. We have seen in the past over 38%. So maybe in July, those numbers will bump back up. And then with respect to the question on participation, that is one of the big cost factors of how many students are eating meals. And so what we saw in October of 2022, and this is what's included in the estimates, breakfast participation of 38.6% and lunch participation of about 60.6%. And we're aggregating these percentages, but in reality, what you're saying is we're assuming that students will continue to the percentage of students that are eating, of free students who are eating, reduced students who are eating, and paid students who are eating, that percentage is going to stay consistent. But if you see a big uptick in the paid students who are eating, then that's going to be a higher cost than an uptick in changing eligibility requirements down the line. That answers your question.
So Julia, that 38% and 60.6%, that's the entire student body as far as breakfast and lunch?
Correct.
Okay. But do we have a breakdown on the free and reduced eligible versus the kids who would be paying full, and what participation is there?
I don't know. That would be a good question for the Agency of Ed.
Okay, thank you.
And I think when JFO did its report a few weeks back, some of these numbers were in there.
Yeah, so the report, the Universal School Meals report that Patrick and I came in, I guess I was remote because I wasn't feeling well, presented, we outline this cost range. And so you can certainly see it in that report and the assumptions put in there. I work very closely with Rosie for creating these estimates. She's as you know, an incredible resource. So the estimates, while coming from JFO, we're working with the administration to come up with the best estimate.
So, yeah, good. I think we should stop there because the next set of witnesses will be starting at 11. And we'll pick this up again after lunch. Beth, thank you for standing by. And if you're available at 1, we'll pick up here where we're leaving off.
Yes, I think you had me booked from 1 to 1:30, and I do have something at 2, or I'm sorry, at 1:30.
Okay, all right, well, we'll see you at 1 then.